Welcome, and thanks for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, we'd encourage you to please leave us a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening to this. This really helps other folks find out about the podcast, our great guests, and the wisdom that they have to share. So without further ado, on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Mr. David Lubell, founder and executive director of Welcoming America. How are you doing today, David?
I'm good, Brad. Thanks for having me.
Good. I'm so glad you can make time to fit this in. I think the work that you guys do is absolutely incredible and crucial in this society that we live in now, and I hope that you can kind of introduce us to it and share a little bit about what it is that you guys do.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
So you've been doing this for how many years now?
I started Welcoming America in 2009. Welcoming Tennessee was the project that led to Welcoming America. That was 2006. But I've been working with immigrants and refugees actually since 1999, so a while.
Okay.
Yeah.
And kind of, how do you envision the work that you do now, and what kind of is it that when somebody asks what you do, how do you describe that?
I tell people that what I do is, I run an organization, but I run an organization that helps communities learn how to become more welcoming and inclusive to immigrants and refugees, but also more welcoming and inclusive to everybody. And yeah, in this modern world, that's a really important thing.
And in terms of community focus, I'm really intrigued that you guys have chosen to focus kind of on that locality level and certifying places as welcoming places. And I wonder, how did it kind of come about that was the focus for you all?
Well, we started in community, and that was a big driver. So yeah, I actually came into this work circuitously through Ecuador, South America. I was a community organizer in college and had worked on like low-income housing issues since high school and middle school. But I didn't speak Spanish, so I ended up moving to Ecuador after college, where I found a program where I could teach English and learn Spanish. And I was really welcomed by the family that had me there in Ecuador, and by the family, the kids, the parents, and it made a huge difference. I saw the power of welcoming for me individually through that experience. And so when I came back to the United States, I ended up in Memphis, Tennessee, actually for a relationship, but also was intrigued by the really rapidly growing demographics and hugely growing immigrant population in Tennessee at that time. And so I wanted to make sure that everyone in the country could have the welcome that I received and reach their full potential. But since I was moving to Memphis, I thought that would be a good place to start. So that's what brought me into the work originally. But what kept me there was this recognition that communities had a lot of potential to become more welcoming, but there were also a lot of communities like Memphis that were changing really quickly in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so there was a lot of unwelcoming happening, and that didn't sit well by me. I wasn't prepared to sit by and sort of watch that happen either. And so communities, it's where it all happens, and it's where movement and positive change, I feel like, happens in this world we live in these days. And in this issue, we saw a lot of change happening, and a lot of potential and a lot of need all at the same time.
I'm intrigued that you mentioned the speed at which this demographic shift was happening. Do you think that kind of played into the need for the work that you guys do, just how fast things were happening and changing?
Totally, and this is something that's often overlooked. Communities plan for a lot of things. They plan for bike trails and for sort of recycling or other, make big strategic plans. But communities don't usually plan for people, and that's a mistake. People are one of the most important things that communities have, probably the most important thing. And communities change, and people who come into those communities change. And so being able to plan for that change is really important. And so, we found that when communities were changing quickly, as Memphis was, Nashville was, and there were a lot of reasons for that: economic there was a big building boom happening in the late 90s in Memphis and in Nashville and other parts of Tennessee. I was based in Memphis and in Nashville, and other economic factors that were bringing immigrants to a region that really didn't have a recent history of immigrants. And when you have, all the data suggests that when you have rapid demographic change, when the percentage change goes up really quickly, that can lead to fear and disorientation from the U.S.-born population. And so if you don't deal with that, if you don't help a community plan for that or deal with that once it's happening, it can go the wrong direction. And I saw it go the wrong direction in many cases and wanted to help communities learn how to make it go in the right direction because it's such an opportunity when you do it right.
I'm intrigued by this idea of planning for that. And just, it seems in some ways something that probably we should have seen coming, but most communities perhaps haven't seen coming. And I wonder how you kind of convince a community that this is something that they need to be prepared for, even when there may not even be anything on the horizon that indicates it's coming.
Usually we don't get involved in a community that doesn't have any immigrants. We usually, unless there's an indication that, there's going to be resettlement to a place that doesn't have experience, or there's going to be some sort of economic driver coming into the community, and they think there's going to be more international workers. But usually it's that there's been a slight growth or a growing uptick in the community, and that's when we are there and available to be helpful. But one thing we say is we sort of use this analogy of a seed in the soil, and so when in a lot of communities, and this was happening in Memphis and in Nashville, the reaction to growing demographic change by people who are actually working to try to make it work is language classes for immigrants and refugees, job training. But what we realize is that that's sort of like putting a seed in a garden and then pouring all the water on the seed and not focusing it all on the soil. And so our work was designed to, yes, help with make sure there's an infrastructure of support, across a community, like language classes, but also that the soil be fertile, that the receiving community, the community that's receiving immigrants and refugees, be receptive and understand the contributions that immigrants and refugees are bringing. And when that soil is fertile, it's much more likely that the seed is going to grow and that the community is going to realize the full potential of the newcomers that are coming. And so that argument was powerful, but it became much more powerful as we started to be able to show real life examples of communities that had done this right and that were benefiting from it. That's really the crucial moment when we went from an important idea to a movement.
Well, I'm intrigued as well because this as I hear you talk, there are very concrete things that can be done to make a place more welcoming, and yet that idea of welcoming is also somewhat of a warm and fuzzy thing, that it's, there are intangibles that go into it as well. And I wonder kind of how you marry those two together in terms of you want to build up an infrastructure that has the necessary classes or education or foundations, but also that there are the mental and more intangible things in place as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, we sometimes have to break through the perception that welcoming is completely touchy-feely, fuzzy, because it can have those connotations. But at the same time, welcoming is something that everyone thinks is a good thing, and everyone feels that their community is a welcoming community just inherently, I believe. And so we want to help them think about how they can become an even more welcoming one. And so in order to really be, in our perspective, a welcoming community, there are two pieces to it. One is, what's the kind of the culture of your community like? So when somebody arrives, a newcomer arrives, what's the reception that they're going to receive? What are the perceptions of newcomers that people in that community have? And so one of the two main things we help communities do, and we work primarily with municipal governments and nonprofits in the local community to help lead these efforts. But on the culture side, we help first analyze, all right, what is this culture like? Are people fearful, or are they tolerant right now towards immigrants, or are they actively wanting immigrants to be here or seeing the value, and then trying to use different methodologies to change the culture. And one of those, three basic methodologies that we use. One is, or help communities use. One is leadership, identifying leaders in the community who can speak out in support of immigrants and refugees from different sectors and can lead the local initiative. The second is contact, the idea that when newcomers are coming, you need to facilitate real contact between people to reduce fear and build understanding. And so helping this sort of welcoming committee in a community organize dialogues and interactions between longtime residents and newcomers in neighborhoods across the city or a community. And then finally, communications, and that recognizes that especially when there's a rapid change in the demographics, the messages that people are hearing tend to be not so accurate and kind of fear-based. And the messages of all the immigrants and refugees who are contributing and who share the values of the local community, they're all there, but the stories aren't being told and not being heard. And so developing different communications mechanisms, like our first campaign was in Nashville, Tennessee, and we actually did a billboard campaign across Middle Tennessee. And those billboards were really sending a message of, look, this is your neighbor, and this neighbor shares your values. Here's this person. Meet them through this communications medium. And so those three kind of prongs of the sort of culture piece are important. And I can talk about the institution change, which is the other part of being welcoming. But first, I just want to make sure I just said a lot around the culture change piece. If you have any specific questions.
Well, I imagine that's an incredibly difficult thing to do, and it's perhaps an even harder thing to measure. And I'm wondering kind of what metrics you guys look at to determine when you've been successful in kind of changing that culture.
Sure. So yes, it is not an easy thing to do. You're right. We did find over time, for example, Nashville, in a place like Atlanta or Dayton, which are cities that we started working with later on in the process. We now work with over 160 cities, but the kind of early adopters beyond Nashville were places like Dayton and Atlanta, and some of those places it was more tolerant, and so there was less of a need to do as much of the communications and the other culture change work. But in Nashville, it was really in a fearful place. If we were to put Nashville on the spectrum of welcoming in 2006, it was really in a fearful part of the spectrum. And so there, we did a lot of this work of dialogue and communications and leadership for several years. And we knew we had made progress in Nashville. Ironically, when there was a referendum on, trying in the city council or introduce a referendum to make Nashville an English-only city so that translations with the local government would only be in English. The polling looked really bad when that campaign started, but when the actual election or referendum happened about a year and a half later, and after a lot of work, again, on our part and others on the ground, the referendum was defeated. And then the people of Nashville said, no, this is not who we are. We are actually a welcoming place. And that was the moment when we realized that we had made progress and that we were starting to realign Nashville with its values, because it is a welcoming place. And so sometimes we've been able to use, kind of data like a referendum. At times we've done polling in places in rural Michigan, for example. Our partner Welcoming Michigan did some polling that demonstrated change in attitudes, but change in attitudes for us is not, it's a temporary thing. Like you could change attitudes for a little bit, but then they could go back. And so the piece around how do you institutionalize your gains? Like if you've got a culture of welcoming, making sure that you capitalize on that by creating institutions in the community that can make sure that immigrants and refugees and others are able to fully integrate, and to make sure that you've institutionalized dialogues within the city and messaging within the city so that it's not just a temporary thing, but a much more permanent thing, is another way to measure change. Because Nashville in 2006, there's no way the political class would have been, willing to create the kind of policy and institutional changes that they later did once the climate shifted.
I'm intrigued to kind of go back a little bit as well and to dig into this question of fear, which I think is all too real. And I'm wondering, where do you think that comes from in this situation? Is it just a fear of the unknown? And if so, what is there something that's spawning that on?
Sure, and it's certainly relevant these days more than ever. But yeah, I actually was lucky enough to get a fellowship to go to the Kennedy School at Harvard, their public policy school. In between my last organization, which was the one that it's called the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, where we started the Welcoming Tennessee project, and then starting Welcoming America in 2009. So in between, I took a year off and got to spend a year just studying. Where are these fears coming from? Like, what's going on there? Because I didn't understand it myself. But a lot of the research really focuses in on this idea that there are people feel material threats, but also underneath that, much more powerfully symbolic threats to changing demographics. So material threat is these folks are going to take my job or somehow impact my family safety, and that is there for some people. Although a lot of the statistics really don't bear out those kind of threats, but underneath that is the symbolic threat, which is more visceral and integral fear that people coming in who are newcomers don't represent my values, and that my values are going to be replaced by theirs, and that I'm going to be no longer relevant in my own community. And so it's that fear that people coming in to my community, newcomers, don't share my values, and are here to somehow take advantage of the fact that I have, open values, that really need to be, that kind of fear needs to be dealt with. And so whether it's through the messaging work to demonstrate the values that are shared, like, for example, in Tennessee, a lot of the messaging that we used was kind of religiously based and demonstrating some of the religious values that were shared. Whereas in Nebraska, we had a billboard with a Nebraska immigrant family, including the kid wearing a Nebraska Cornhuskers jersey, which is a value that is very important in Nebraska. But it's just really important, the contact piece, to meet people and to see that the values are shared, but they are shared. Once you meet people, once you start to get past that feeling of fear, but it's real, and it can be exploited, but it's not the reality. And the reality, it takes time to get past the misinformation and the misperceptions, but that's what it takes to move communities past fear.
I'm thinking in there about this values question. I think that there's also this idea that I think I was talking about with someone earlier, that in some ways what you really want to do is make everything very normalized. Is that something that resonates with you? That this is no longer a new thing, that this is the new state of our population in some ways?
Yeah, for sure, definitely. And the more they did some research that showed, for example, a picture. They I can't remember what community it was, but they showed a picture of a refugee sitting in bleachers, and then a picture of a refugee sitting in bleachers with the local high school football team jersey on, and the feelings of openness and trust that people felt when they saw the picture of the refugee with the jersey. Trying to demonstrate that this newcomer is part of us, and using different just tools to demonstrate what is already a fact is important. That is normalizing. When you see somebody in your local high school football jersey, you're like, wait, this is just another person from our community who wants us to be successful. And so normalizing the state of things and demonstrating that there's nothing threatening about that being normalized is really important.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provides students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guest. Thank you. I'm also intrigued by this contact piece that you mentioned, and how, in the same way that you mentioned here, the normalization of it in terms of, the neighborhood that I live in happens to be a neighborhood that a large number of the refugee community has been resettled in for whatever reason. But there are a lot of people that never see immigrants or refugees in their day-to-day life, and I'm sure that plays a huge role in their willingness to have these conversations in some ways.
Yeah, and the key really is trying to meet. We find that there's about 20% in the average community. There's about 20% of people who are kind of predisposed to being welcoming and would be supportive. If you had an initiative like ours, which is a very community-based initiative and needs the support of everyday citizens, and then maybe 60% of the community is kind of ambivalent, doesn't have much exposure, might have a little bit of fear, but it's not driving them to be overly against the changing demographics or growing diversity. And then there's 20% of the community that might be much more difficult to sway or much less likely to support growing diversity in their communities. And so a lot of the work, as far as this piece around creating a culture of welcome in a community, is really trying to work with that 20% of supporters, really trying to engage them, to go out into communities to talk to that 60%. That's hard. It's hard to find the people. You need to make it easy to go to places. For example, in Nashville, we had a lot of pastors on our welcoming committee there from different churches, and so they were able to open the door to those churches, and then having events and dialogues at the church after services, providing food and coffee, making it easy for people to come and participate in the conversations was key. Because if you're just talking to the people who are already supportive, then you're not going to get where you need to go.
Mm-hmm. Has it been, we've obviously seen some vast increases in the inflammatory language around some of these issues in the past year or so, a little more than. And I wonder, has that made it easier to find that 20% that's willing to then be a supporter, or is it harder to then find those people that are willing to carry on those conversations?
It has. It's an interesting silver lining of everything that's happening, but it's absolutely made it easier. People who might have been, less ready to stand up and, sort of take what is valuable time away from other things to support these efforts are now seeing the urgency of it. And so the interest in just everyday community members to be supportive and to help advance welcoming has increased significantly in the last 8-10 months. And the number of cities overall that have joined our network and that want to be part of this have also expanded quite a bit in the last 6 or 8 months. So that's definitely a silver lining to the current climate and the current situation.
Why do you think it is that cities are now reaching out and more interested in becoming welcoming, and kind of why is it that that's easier on a local level like that than at a national level?
And I've done work in other parts of the world, and it's been consistent. It's not just in the United States where it's easier to do this work on the local level than on the national level. National level, when it comes to an issue like immigration, it's an emotional issue, and it can be divisive, and for whatever reason, when it gets to the national level, it just turns into an impasse often in a lot of places. But on the local level, people are arriving, and communities are trying to figure out how to make the most of it. That they don't have the power of, or the responsibility to think about, like, who should we keep into our community, who should we keep out. Like, we're not going to build a wall around my city where I live now in Decatur. And so the question is, how do we make this work? And how we have all these people coming in with all these new perspectives and skills. How do we maximize that? And just whether it's in Italy or in, Germany where we work, or here in the United States, communities want to figure it out. And so they're just light years ahead of nationalities or national governments all around the world, and certainly the United States. Like people just want to figure it out and make the most of it. And they get it, and they like the growing diversity. They like the new restaurant options that they have. Frankly, that matters to people. Millennials like to have diversity in their communities for all sorts of different reasons, and so do other people. And so community is an open runway for this type of work.
Well, I'd like to take a step back and look at that institutionalizing this change in some ways, because I think that, you've mentioned that there's kind of been an upsurge in interest in what you guys are doing, and I'm wondering, you have to recognize, like all things, that there's a cycle to this, and that's, you're probably not going to be, for lack of a better term, the cause du jour for forever. So how do you kind of institutionalize and make sure that these changes that you're seeing now are going to last and be there forever?
Sure. The institutionalizing is crucial. And we've been institutionalizing, way before this issue became more hot, sexy, whatever you want to call it. Starting in 2009, at a time when I talked to my relatives about what I did, they didn't totally understand as much as they do now. It's kind of a microcosm. People get it now, and you're right. It'll fade a little bit, but in sort of the national spotlight. But the majority of the cities that we've added before, it became a bigger issue. And so the reason we've been able to do that is because we've been able to demonstrate to communities that they can benefit. So I'll give an example of Dayton. Dayton was one of the first communities that started in this movement, this local welcoming communities movement. And they decided that they had been losing population for over 50 years, and losing tax base for all that time, and morale, frankly, and wanted to turn that around. And so they spent a year doing what now all of our communities do. They don't always spend a year doing it, but all of our communities that especially once they've gotten past, kind of the more difficult climate and are ready to institutionalize, Dayton spent a year planning and listening to people from all of the different sectors of the community to say, what would it mean for Dayton to be welcoming? What kind of policies, what kind of programs, what kind of practices could everyone in this community adapt to be welcoming? And after that planning process was finished, they created an Office of Welcome Dayton within the city, and have been implementing the Welcome Dayton plan ever since. And so, and actually, Dayton just recently became our first welcoming or certified welcoming community. And so we now have a standard or a certification program where we can certify cities as welcoming, and that's, the standard is helpful because it lays out, what exactly are the different types of policies that are needed. If you want to kind of hit the gold standard of what welcoming means, what are the different types of programs that a community needs to undertake? What's the process involved? And so, Dayton was one of the first. They were a pioneer, and now they're a pioneer in our certification. They're the first certified welcoming community. That happened about 2 months ago. As far as the institutionalizing, it involves, first, if you want to institutionalize the work, you need to, whether it's, Dayton or any town USA, the first step is to really bring together different stakeholders from the community, to think about what it would mean in their community to be welcoming. And the standard creates a framework, so you can start looking at different areas like education or business development to see how inclusive and welcoming those different areas of a city are. And then you can start thinking about, all right, what are we going to do to make it easier for people to start a business, easier for people to make sure they can access their dreams educationally. And over time, the plan arises. The office, if it's not already there, an office of immigrant affairs or welcoming or what have you is created within the city. And the policies get created, and all of a sudden you have you're on your way to creating a truly actively welcoming community.
Well, I'm wondering, as we've talked a lot about the cultural side of things, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the infrastructure side now, and what kind of needs to be built up from that side to make things work. And you mentioned some of that, I'm sure, as terms of the local government. What other things kind of need to happen to make sure that we're doing this right?
Sure, and anyone who I'm not going to get into as much detail as if someone was interested in learning more about some of the nitty-gritty details, you can go to our website, which is welcomingamerica.org, and go to certified welcoming on the website, because there you can see the full standard, which lays it out in much more detailed terms than I will. But I'll just, I'm going to give the example of Atlanta as a way of making it a little, more tangible. So again, Atlanta, the mayor of Atlanta, who's now the outgoing mayor because his second term is over, but Mayor Reed has been terrific. He asked us a couple of years ago, how can we become a welcoming city? And so we helped him sort of form an advisory committee of people from the business community, from the immigrant refugee community, from these different sectors of the community, to think about, all right, what would it mean to institutionally be welcoming, and what could, Coca-Cola was on that advisory committee, as was, were individual refugees and immigrants and consulates from different countries and other stakeholders. But yeah, they were really looking at it holistically in different areas. So, part of becoming certified is just doing this planning process and identifying if an immigrant or refugee comes to Atlanta, what are all the barriers that they would face? And then how do we together start to eliminate those barriers? So then they broke up into different, created committees around education, like what are all the barriers to full education, to education, and what can be done policy-wise, otherwise, and then like workforce development and economic development involved, the business community and entrepreneur community, thinking, all right, if immigrants and refugees are very likely to be entrepreneurs, what do the policies look like now around small business creation within the city, and how can we change those policies to be, make it a lot easier and culturally sensitive for immigrant entrepreneurs to start a business, because we want them to start businesses in our community. So whether it's education or economic development or public safety or other areas, I'm not going to go into every single category, but these are the types of categories where, the community sat down and said, okay, let's make it so that it's much, much more likely that any person, and it doesn't just have to be an immigrant or refugee, like in Detroit, where we've done this work, there was a lot, it was a great opportunity for Detroit to say, okay, everyone lives in this community. Wait a minute, it's really hard for an African-American entrepreneur to start a business too. These policies are difficult for everybody. And so those policies changed, and that didn't just benefit immigrants, it benefited everyone. But again, it's an opportunity to look at, okay, somebody who's here, somebody who comes here, what are all those barriers to full inclusion, to full success, and how do we work together to change them? And a lot of this is around belonging. In the 21st century, one of the biggest challenges that our countries and our communities face is the fact that a lot of people don't feel like they belong, and this is a way to, institutionalize belonging, which is extremely important in these times.
Oh, that's such a compelling vision, and it's true enough that if no matter where you're coming from, if you don't feel like you belong, there's very little likelihood that you're going to feel welcome or even feel like a solid member of society or contributing to anything in any way.
Yeah, and then there's all sorts of negative, things like ramifications for that you want to avoid, and there's all sorts of lost potential that you want to avoid, and that's why. Maybe in the 20th century we could think about these things in other ways, but I really think in the 21st century, and if you look at the recent election, there was an undercurrent of certain segments of the population not feeling like they belong, and we don't want any segment of the population to feel like they don't belong, because this just doesn't benefit anybody. It creates challenges for everybody.
And so I think that kind of leads into this question of I think that you and I could sit here and talk about how valuable it is for a community to be welcoming and all the economic and social and benefits of that. But when you have a community that's kind of on the fence or doesn't know or doesn't think that this is something that's important for them, how do you kind of go about having that conversation with them?
So honestly, this is funny. I have kids myself, and I don't want them to succumb to peer pressure. But at the same time, when it comes to this work, peer pressure is a powerful force. And sometimes, we're dealing with human emotions, and immigration brings out some negative emotions if it's not handled and managed correctly. But also, you can try to steer emotions and human sort of behaviors in a positive way. And so, in this case, if Dayton, for example, becomes welcoming and turns around 50 years of population decline and is gaining tax base, is gaining, neighborhoods that were boarded up or business districts that were boarded up are now much more likely to be thriving. And so all of a sudden there's a lot of other communities in Ohio that say, wait a minute, we have a similar dynamic. Why didn't anybody tell us about this? Why don't we do this? And so you do see, this peer pressure on a regional basis. And that's been a key to the growth of our work and of our movement. So, from one community in Ohio, you go to 8 communities in a relatively short amount of time, including most of the major cities in Ohio. In Michigan, and we went from one community with our partner Welcoming Michigan to, I think it's now 18 cities and counties in Michigan. And so, and that's, in the South, we had Nashville first, and then Atlanta saw what Nashville was doing and said, wait a minute, we don't want to miss the boat here. This is, we're a global city. We need to position ourselves as such, as well as a city of civil rights. And so, and after Atlanta got on board, then Charlotte saw that and said, wait a minute, we compete with Atlanta. We don't want to fall behind. And so we call that the kind of the race to the top, this positive, kind of friendly but positive competition between communities to be welcoming. And that sense of the message behind that is really positive. It's that being welcoming and inclusive is a net gain for communities, and immigrants and refugees are a net gain for communities. That's the underlying message behind that, which is very different than a lot of the messages we're hearing these days about immigrants and refugees, which focus a lot more on this idea of threat or of burden. But if immigrants and refugees were a burden, why would all these 160 communities and growing be competing with each other for them? There's just something else going on, and communities are able to demonstrate that very tangibly, and that's why we've grown, and that's why we will continue to grow as a network and as a movement.
I'm really intrigued by this moving from burden to asset kind of language. I think it's incredibly powerful, and I'm always struck. In a previous lifetime, I worked at Starbucks with a gentleman who was a refugee from Ethiopia. This guy was a microbiologist with his PhD from the former Soviet Union, but here he was, couldn't be happier to be working at Starbucks and as a parking lot attendant. But man, I couldn't help but think that his talents were wasted here, and I wonder how we kind of improve our welcome in such a way that we recognize the talents and the assets that some of these folks bring to the table.
Yeah, it's huge. And one of the advantages we have in the global economy is that we still have the most immigrants of any nation in the world. And, we are still seen as a nation of immigrants despite the challenges. But that has given us an advantage throughout our history. The strivers, the people who get up and go, and the entrepreneurs who have come to America to, if you think about the number of Fortune 500 companies that have been started by immigrants, it's a huge number, and refugees. And so yeah, already this country, even without really trying that hard, has unleashed this potential that other parts of the world, other countries haven't been able to. But we'd love to calculate what that sort of untapped potential is and try to demonstrate that on an economic basis, on a social basis. But it's huge. I can tell you that much, because we've seen the difference between a welcoming Dayton and a just a Dayton, or a welcoming Atlanta versus just Atlanta. We've seen some of that untapped potential start to get unleashed. But if you think about that on the whole, on a whole country scale, it's huge. And so our job is just community by community start demonstrating what happens when you unleash that. But eventually we'd love to try to, really try to calculate not only what has been unleashed, but what could be unleashed if you had a country that was really helping to reduce barriers so that full potential could be unleashed. But it's massive, and we can do it community by community, and eventually I hope our country does it on a national level in a much more concerted way, obviously, than now, but even than ever, really.
I'm also intrigued by this kind of question that I think that there's often, a feeling that because these populations aren't necessarily welcomed, they're not as big of a participant in civil and social life as they maybe should be based on their just sheer numbers. And I wonder, is that something that we can rectify by being welcoming, or how do we go about making sure that everyone has access to the same benefits in the social and civil life that we'd like to see happen?
Yeah, I mean, the planning process that I talked about before is focused on that. And one of the areas of the, in these different categories, I talked about like economic development and economic empowerment. I talked about education, but civic engagement is another one. And so that's any planning process from any city. That's something that's analyzed is, okay, what is right now the civic participation, and that can mean everything from voting to serving on boards to volunteering in the community to a host of other things. But in the process, each community identifies, okay, how is it going, and what are the barriers that might prevent that participation from community members, and all these innovative ideas are brought to the table. And one that I really like is actually from Nashville. Nashville, once they institutionalized, they created an Office of Immigrant Affairs within the city, and the Office of Immigrant Affairs created this program called My City Academy, which is basically it's a 12-week program where immigrants from across the city can come weekly. They have to apply, but then they can come if they get into the program. When they get into the program, they come weekly and are exposed to different elements of the community, whether it's government agencies that can be useful to know more about, and meet the people from those agencies and hear about how they can be valuable to the community, to community groups coming in and talking about opportunities for volunteering, opportunities for serving on boards and commissions, and so that's a 12-week program that runs annually, and it's a great opportunity to what it recognizes is that when people come, they're very busy. They're trying to find employment. They're trying to support their families. But if there is a vehicle, if there is a staircase for them to get on towards civic participation, they're going to get on it, and the program's oversubscribed. And so once they get on that, then they can tell other people about it. And so it's just one example of how you identify the barriers and then figure out a way. And the My City Academies happens in the immigrant community. So again, it's reducing barriers to get even to the class itself. But that program is now being replicated by a lot of our cities around the country, and it's just one example of if you're being more thoughtful and you're planning for these things, you can overcome some of the barriers and understand that it's not human nature or you can't just kind of hope through osmosis that things are going to change, but it's a collective effort to be inclusive, and that's not just for immigrants or refugees. It's kind of program that would be valuable and is valuable for any member of the community.
Well, I'm intrigued hearing you talk that, a lot of this stuff is kind of driven from the government side of things. And I wonder if that's, I'm sure you guys have made an intentional step to do it that way, but I wonder where is that kind of line between what should be driven by the government and what should be driven by the community itself? Sure.
So our work is always designed to be both. When we started, it was actually just being driven by nonprofits. When we were doing that, for example, in Nashville, at that time, the municipal government wasn't really ready to, the climate was so bad that they weren't ready to do work with us. But then once we worked on worked with the other sectors and helped to change the climate, that changed the political calculations. But in any community, the model is working with civil society and with municipal government. So, like, for example, we wouldn't have certified Dayton as a city if they didn't go through comprehensive planning process that brought in, major nonprofit partners, major major business partners, immigrant and refugee community members. The whole community needs to be part of the process. And in Atlanta, the Welcoming Atlanta Advisory Committee that helped do the planning, the multi-sector committee, now serves as the advisory committee for the Office of Immigrant Affairs, overseeing to make sure that the project is being implemented well, and to make sure that they can have a role in supporting it through their different institutions. That's also really important for changes of administration. For example, we had a great mayor, Mayor Carl Dean in Nashville, who helped push through a lot of the initiatives that I've talked about in Nashville, but then his term ended. And so it was the civil society groups that had already come together that made sure that the next generation of candidates also were going to be supportive of the Office of Immigrant Affairs and supportive of moving the work forward, which they did and which happened. And now, Mayor Megan Barry, who's the next mayor, has also been super good on positioning Nashville as a welcoming city and supporting those efforts. So yeah, it's got to be both. And sometimes you have to start with civil society in places where politically it's not possible to bring the municipal government on at all in the beginning. So that happens sometimes.
Very interesting. Well, I'm sure you've been to communities all over the country and worked in a number of different places. And I wonder, kind of, as you go to new communities, are there indicators as you get to a new place that a place is doing well, or that a community is thriving in some ways?
You mean that the initiative is thriving, or that the community is thriving as a result of the work that's going on?
Either way.
Sure. Well, I mean, the work piece of it is clear, based on, looking at who's part of the grouping, the committee that's involved. Is it a really broad sector, or broad swath of the community? Are the right people at the table from the business community, from the religious community, and is it a really inclusive group of people? And then, what does the plan look like? How is it being implemented? What kind of policies? We have a lot of ways to measure whether the initiative is being successful. And then, and that's also the pathway to certification, which is another way of measuring. If you've created all of these different policies and all of done everything right, and are have mechanisms to maintain a welcoming culture, then yeah, you're going to get certified. And that's a way for us to measure. And certification lasts 2 years, and then you have to get certified again. So it's not like a permanent thing. Obviously, it shouldn't be. But then beyond that, yeah, I mean, we're working to now demonstrate other ways of showing, because it's hard because the initiative is still relatively new. But we've started to show, how, for example, Nashville has gained economically overall by doing this. And so we did some research in collaboration with the Nashville Chamber of Commerce that demonstrated that, in 2012, by 2012, Nashville had the fastest job growth of any city in the country, and has been in the top 10 ever since. And, the chamber research demonstrated that being welcoming was a factor. That when, Nashville came to a fork in the road, decided that they wanted to go the direction of welcoming. And, companies want to move to places where their employees and their employee spouses and their kids feel welcome, where there's an infrastructure to support them. Hospitality is the second biggest industry in Nashville. And so taking the route of welcoming was important. And it meant that they could attract more companies maybe than other parts of the Southeast at the time. They could attract immigrant entrepreneurs. They could even attract, creative people who, again, want to be in communities that embrace diversity. So that kind of example, we're trying to do more and more of demonstrating the kind of the macro benefits, and also trying to demonstrate how it's benefiting long-term outcomes for immigrants and refugees. But it's a process. And we're still a young movement, but we've already been able to demonstrate in a lot of places that everybody can be better off, and everybody is better off by doing this, and that's really important. That's how you grow, and that's how you build a movement.
Fascinating. Well, I wonder, I kind of hate to start bringing this to a close, but I wonder if you could share something that you've learned along the way that maybe was a little unexpected, or something that maybe you didn't think you'd be thinking was important at this point.
Sure. So I would say that the most important, or the most surprising thing I've learned, there's been a lot of surprising things along the way, but I'd say that one of the most surprising things was just the importance of having empathy for people in receiving communities. And that's kind of jargon, but again, receiving communities, just the people who are in the community when immigrants and refugees are arriving, people who have lived there for a long time residents. And so, to vilify people who are have any element of fear of the changing demographics is very counterproductive, and it's also contrary to just what the research shows is kind of normal. In that, in so many case studies around the world, the same findings come that if it's rapid change, especially in a place that's not used to that demographic change, that fear increases because it's just things are changing and nobody's really explaining why things are changing. And so, the importance of having empathy for people who are having some element of discomfort, not for people who are, having big marches in Charlotte. You don't have empathy for alt-right or the blatant stuff that's just not acceptable and needs to be completely spoken against. But there are a lot of people who are good people that just need to be heard and need to have that contact and need to start to see this as just the next chapter in their community. But if there's a vacuum and no one's explaining why things are changing, and then the only person who's explaining it is a spokesperson on talk radio who you don't want to be your spokesperson, creating an infrastructure to help and support those people. Every community in the world that's changing in any way, and most communities needs to have that kind of infrastructure. That's how you avoid the problems. And that is a big goal of mine personally, starting with the United States, is to try to make sure that every community in the country that is experiencing change in that way has the infrastructure in place, because when it's there, and communities can be supported through it, they come out the other end stronger and they get it. But if you start to vilify people for having those fears, as opposed to setting up an infrastructure to support them and to let them have that essential contact with newcomers, because once you have the contact and you meet a family and you see that their dreams are the same as yours, everything changes after that. So we need to have an infrastructure to be able to build that empathy, and that's a huge goal of mine, is to build that infrastructure across the country.
Well, I wonder if you could kind of close us out with a story that encapsulates what happens when communities do this well, or something that has shown how powerful this can be.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that Nashville. Let's come back to Nashville. I live in Atlanta, or Decatur, which is just outside of Atlanta now. But I started this initiative with others in Nashville, and it's still somewhere that's very close to my heart. But yeah, to me, Nashville is just this powerful example of that this work is possible, because in 2006, when we started the work, Nashville, the Nation magazine called Nashville and Middle Tennessee the epicenter of the new nativist movement in the United States. It had really, the fear narrative was really being stoked up by different actors, both from inside, but a lot from outside of the community. And it was just going in a direction that, to me, as someone who had been living for several years in Nashville and even more in Tennessee, was just so scary and disconcerting. The idea, like, radio talk show hosts or others could say what they wanted, and people, burnt down a local mosque in a hate crime. And I mentioned the English only referendum. There are all these other just horrible rhetoric flying around, and no repercussions for politicians, likening immigrants to, cockroaches or other things. And it was post September 11th. It was a dark time. But to see Nashville sort of rise to the occasion, wrestle with the difficulties, and come out the other end stronger economically, socially, is really then, it just gives me hope for any community and for our country as a whole. And everybody has different feelings about any president, and so whatever your feelings are about President Obama, I think the people of Nashville were impressed when he, in 2014, actually came to Nashville and gave a speech about this, saying that Nashville was a really impressive example of a community that had wrestled with immigration and come out the other end stronger, and had the courage to wrestle with it, and to imagine a new type of community where everybody could be contributing. But yeah, Nashville really gives me hope for the future of this country, that even though we're in a difficult time now as a country, community by community, we can wrestle with this, and we can come out the other end stronger. So yeah, I need to hold on to that hope in difficult times, but I am still very optimistic in the long term, and it starts in communities.
Well, David, thank you so much for taking the time today. If people are interested in learning more about what you guys are up to, where can they find more information?
Just go to welcomingamerica.org. Our website is chock full of information, a whole bunch of resources that can help you start from just having dialogues with newcomers in your neighborhood to a whole bunch of other things. But check out the website, check out the resources part of the website, and contact us directly if you have more questions. But we'd love to talk to anybody interested in doing this work.
Wonderful. And for those of you all that are interested in learning more about CityWorks Expo, you can find us at cityworksxpo.com. But David, thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon.
Sure. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the date for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia. And keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksxpo.com. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.